And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 232. If you're looking to improve your understanding of photography, then you've come to the right place. So today we're going to be looking at the notion of capturing movement. Movement in photography. Photography is something which is a two-dimensional piece of paper or a screen, and yet movement is something that happens through time and through space. So how do we capture that? So that's really what we're going to be looking at today, so stick around and we'll make a start. So yes, welcome to episode 232. Still have to keep thinking about that one. So we're live here on YouTube. If you happen to be watching live, that is, then leave a comment and let me know where you're from. Let me know who you are. Let me know what the weather's doing, and we can get the chat going. Here in sunny southwest Scotland, yes, the sun and even a little bit of warmth. I mean, for here, we've got something like about 16 degrees Celsius, which is swelteringly hot. It's practically summer. As of course I know Fiji in Chennai would be freezing, absolutely frozen in this kind of weather. But yes, here it's positively summer-like. It does make me wonder whether anybody from locally will bother tuning in, because I imagine everybody else will be out for a walk or in their garden. Still, I see we have a couple of comments in already, so not been completely deserted yet. Robert says, howdy all from New Mexico, where we will have to catch up on the podcast later due to travel. Okay, so... Sorry, Robert said hello but won't be here. April says, greetings from sunny Long Island, New York. Can only stay a short while the UK catches up with time. Well, you say us catching up. Maybe it's you who've jumped the gun. All depends on your perspective, doesn't it, really? What else have we got? Oh, John says, hello from Ohio. And he's telling Robert he's loved New Mexico. Hopes he has a good trip. VG joins us from Chennai. Says a good evening. Marilyn says hello from Colorado. Nadia says hi from Fife. Meg says hello everyone. VG says quite hot here. We're at 32 degrees Celsius just now. So 32 degrees is about as hot as it's ever got in Scotland. And I'm not entirely sure it's ever really got above that amount here. And at that point I think the tarmac was probably quite close to melting. Janet says hello from a warmish Mississauga, plus 2 degrees C, going up to a plus 7. So that's pretty warm in Canada in the middle of winter. Mind you, are you still in the middle of winter, still getting big snowfalls? Again, we're in that kind of March point where it could be middle of winter, it could be middle of summer almost, you know. Yes, a varied month of this one. Excuse me. So, yes, that's slightly dry throat, so bear with me, please. Right, okay, so we have people in. We have content. We have a topic to discuss. Janet says March weather varies a lot. So quick update then on the Smug Points. So Smug Points Leaderboard for March basically is being headed up by all those who submitted something to the feedback session last week. So Nadia, Janet and VG are all on 30 points each because they got 25 Smug Points for submitting an image for feedback and 5 points for turning up and leaving a comment. Robert got 25 points, but he didn't turn up to leave a comment, so he didn't get the extra 5. However, he has left a comment this time, so I think he's trying to sneak in the extra 5 points, even though he won't be around for the rest of the podcast. Isn't it amazing? Just for the sake of 5 Smug Points, can you cheat the system? I might let you have them anyway. Right, okay, so what are we going to talk about? Yes, so today then is the notion of capturing time. No, not capturing time, capturing movement, sorry, capturing movement in photography. Because yes, photography is this strange thing. Movement, by its very nature, contains 2 primary aspects and qualities to it. One is that it happens through time, and the second is that it happens through space. So it uses up 2 of the 4 dimensions, mark it out as movement. Whereas photography is just 2-dimensional. Up and across, up and down, across, and what have you. So it's flat. So there's no sense of depth, there's no space anything can move through, and there's no time because it's a frozen moment. So on a whole philosophical concept of existence, photography is missing 2 dimensions. And these 2 dimensions are what actually sort of define and typify how we go about saying what movement actually is. So, as such then, how do we capture that idea of movement in photography? So, well, photography, in a sense, everything is moving. Even a mountain is moving. If you were off the earth, it would be moving because you would see it revolving around the thing. But even essentially, it is decaying. Bits of atoms are dropping off it. It's getting weathered. Or it is growing because continents are pushing it up. So even a mountain is moving as such. It's just at a level that's imperceptible to us. And it's that notion of perception. This is what we're trying to do. So we're trying to, when we create a photo which appears to capture movement, what we need to do is fool the eyes, fool the perception of the viewer into making them think that they are seeing something that they're not. They are just seeing, but having said that, all photography is that. All photography is a set of pixels, dots on a screen or dots on a piece of paper. And the brain then interprets that. So when you see a picture of a ball, it isn't an actual ball, it is a picture of a ball, and the brain interprets the picture, the lines, into our sense of what a ball is. But even more so then with a ball that is moving. So how do we capture that sense? And that's really what we're going to talk about. So, and this is then ahead of the idea that I'm going to set a challenge then. So in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have the Capturing Movement Challenge. So I'll talk a bit more about that at the end of the podcast. In the meantime, of course, if you can make sure you like the podcast, just click the like just now. That's always useful. And, you know, if you haven't done so already, do subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know about future ones as well. Right. So let's make a start on giving you examples. So, well, the part of the problem is that what we end up with is because it is flat and because it has no sense of time, movement, we can have pictures which we take which are actually of moving things but don't necessarily appear to be moving. We can't be sure. So let me give you an example here. So here's an example then of taken at a parade. So we've got a bunch of vintage cars driving down the road. This is just pretty much literally out my window. In fact, I think I might have been sitting out of our bedroom window on the top floor with my camera, just pointing it up the road when I took this photo. And so we've got all these vintage cars driving down the road. They're not driving very fast, but they are driving at a kind of walking pace. And you can, in fact, if you look at the behind, you can see that there's more of the parade where people are actually literally walking behind them. So there is a walking pace movement going on. However, from this photo, it's absolutely impossible to tell. These cars could be parked. They might have stopped while something's going on ahead. You can't actually tell whether they are moving or not. You can imply that they're moving, but they could just as easily be parked. They could just as easily be static on the road. Another example then, something where we know it has to be moving, but maybe it isn't moving very much, is something like this. So here we've got a red kite in the sky, and it's in the air. Therefore, it has to be moving, except for the fact that it's hovering on the updrafts. It's sort of floating there. So again, it's moving, but it's moving very slowly. If it had been moving any faster, there is no way I would have caught it with my camera. I'm a portrait photographer, I'm a studio photographer, I'm a narrative photographer. I am not a wildlife photographer. My wildlife tends to be mediocre at best. There's a kite feeding station a few miles up the road from here, and where you've got places and you turn up with your camera and you stick your biggest lens that you've got and you shoot away, and my hit rate is terrible. This was probably the best photo I've ever had of a red kite, and part of that is because the sun's behind it, and so you've got that lovely little backlight light coming through the tail. But the point is that it was hovering there, And because it was hovering, and if it was moving, it really wasn't moving very fast, I took the photo. But it doesn't have actually that much sense of movement. We know it's sort of floating there. Meg says, I really like the curves of the wings. Marilyn says, great shot. Oh, thank you. It helped that it was basically posing for me. Or we take something like this. Now this, where you've got one of these aerial dancers, these kind of, where they've got the big ribbon cloth thing and they spiral up and climb up and do all the movements and that. They're quite spectacular. Now, this one, again, have I caught her mid-movement, or have I caught her in a pause in the movement? And chances are I've caught her in a pause. The reality is that this was a very low light situation. It was some big conference thing in Easterbrook Hall in Dumfries, about 300 people all sitting around tables, so the lighting wasn't actually that bright. There was a wee spotlight on this one and somebody on the other side of the stage. I have my camera, I'm firing away, my ISO is very high because the light is very low, and so there wasn't a lot of chance. Most of the photos I took of her were out of focus. Or if I had my shutter speed high enough, were so noisy that they were absolutely unusable. So my compromise then was to actually try and take a photo in the pauses. So she's gone down the cloth, and then there's a dramatic moment for about 2 seconds or whatever where she holds the pose and then she changes and moves again. And if you're trying to capture movement and you don't have a lot of time, then what you're trying to do is catch those pauses in the movement. So a little bit like if you were throwing a ball up and down, and a ball is being thrown, it's going up and then coming down, and going up and coming down. Then the moment where it's moving the least is, well, first of all, before it's left the hand, but also at the highest point. It gets up to the high, slows down, pauses, and then comes back down again. And if you take a photo at the point that it's at its highest, it's not moving as fast, whereas it's moving faster as it's accelerating downwards. So you can kind of use that to try and capture that sense of movement. However, that notion of the pause is more about kind of just being quick enough to go, oh, she stopped, click, and managing to fire off the click before she started moving again. So it has a sense of movement. Certainly with the hair dangling down and the sense of diagonals, you've got a sense of movement. But it's not necessarily really capturing. I'm not really capturing something that's actually moving. Compare this then to another aerial dancer, the shot that I took once before, which is this one here. And I think in this case, you really do get a much better sense of movement. Because in this one, we've got the curve of the ribbon, and her hair is flying about at an angle that isn't just hanging. So, whereas this one, if we look at her hair is hanging down because gravity is causing the hair to hang down because her hair is upside down. With this one, the hair isn't hanging down. So she's clearly in a state of movement. That angle, where her body is tucked up, isn't an angle that could be held for a couple of seconds. That's a mid-movement kind of angle. And then it's accentuated by the curve of the fact that the ribbon is moving as well. So it's a much more of a sense of movement here. Now you've got the crowd down below, but that sense there, I think you really do get much more a sense of movement. So that's good. So what is it then that's creating a difference between a sort of static hint of movement and really feeling that you're getting an actual movement? And that's really what I'm going to be exploring today. So I'm going to run you through a whole bunch of photos and talk. So yeah, leave me comments as we go. Let me know your thoughts. Give me, if you've got questions and all the rest of it, and I will answer them as I go, or give you examples as they come up of what would be, how I'm going to answer them. A couple more comments here, actually. Just see. Marilyn said, great shot. April said, good catch, Kim. Nick's joined us from a sunny southwest, so down in Bath. And VG says, beautiful shot. Right, okay. So, in that sense then of movement, that primarily The main thing we're going to be talking about is shutter speed, because shutter speed is what makes the difference in that sense of how much movement you're catching or not. And ultimately, what the shutter speed is also going to dictate, or is going to make the difference, is going to help us with the photography, is that notion of, if we are trying to capture movement, we are capturing a moment that we wouldn't normally see or be able to properly register with the naked eye. So if you've got, when we look at something that's moving, a horse jumping, a ball flying through the air, then we see things in movement. We don't freeze that moment in our heads. We're watching the trajectory. Now, we know what the frozen moment is, but only because we've kind of constructed it afterwards. We observe the actual movement. We don't have a frozen moment. So a frozen moment, say, where you've got a splash of water and all the little droplets look like glass, that's not something we ever really see with the naked eye. Likewise, though, if you have a blur, if you have it smeared across because you took a slow shutter speed and the water or the ball or the horse or whatever are then out of focus as it moves, then that's also something we never really see with the human eye either. And so this is why I think photography and movement can be so much fun, can be so interesting, because it gives you that chance to really capture images that the human eye and brain never actually see. And now you can pause it for us to really examine it in a way that we would never normally be able to do. And that's absolutely fascinating. And I think that's then at the core part of this notion of capturing movement, and what will be at the core of the Capturing Movement Challenge. I really want you to start thinking about this now. As I'm going through, start thinking about how this might apply, how you might apply it to your own challenge, what you might decide to have a go at doing. Oh, that's April rushing off. Yes, a quick reminder just before you disappear. April, 30th of April. 30th of March. So in another 2 weeks, then our clocks will have gone forward in the UK and will have caught up. So one more out of sync next week, but should be back in sync next week for those of you in North America. And for Fiji in Chennai, it means that in 2 weeks' time, everything shifts an hour for you. Right. Okay, let's find another picture then. So if we say go to something like, where what we're going to do is that freezing time bit. As another example here. So here we have a frozen moment. This was actually done with a glass artist. So she's got glass powders and what have you, which she's putting onto another sheet of glass, and that's all going to get fired and all the colours are going to kind of merge together. But it's going through a tea strainer. So a little bit like, again, I did once before, using icing sugar through a tea strainer over the top of some mince pies to make it look a bit like it was snowing. And this is very much a captured moment, a moment of frozen, where all the little dust particles are just absolutely frozen. And in order to capture these, I've also got a backlight. So I've got an off-camera flash somewhere over to the right and behind. You can see the way that it is catching the side of her hand, but part of her hand is in shadow. Look where the shadow is falling on the tea strainer. And you'll see that it's just catching the edge here. So you work backwards, you can see where the light is coming from. But because it's a dark background and the light's coming from behind, like every little dot is kind of showing. And what was the shutter speed on that? Shutter speed is 160th of a second, so not overly fast, but fast enough to be able to capture the powder. Okay? So that then is that kind of frozen moment which we wouldn't normally be able to see with the eye. Another example of this is this one of Zoe getting painted by Morag. So it's a whole shoot there. I've talked about this several years ago, back in the early days now, I think probably about 4 years ago. But a shoot where the model was being painted by a clothes designer, and these are like watercolour poster paint type things, you know, powder tube, being squirted out, and you could see it literally splashing across Zoe's face here. That coming out of the tube, frozen, and kind of line already caught, line as it's crossing and coming down onto the head. And that's a kind of moment which, again, we would never be able to, we wouldn't see. We'd see the, and then it's over, and then we see the laugh, and then we see Zoe laughing, and we'd be taking a quick look at the way the paint had fallen. But it's not a frozen, that frozen moment. So that's kind of if you're playing around. So, well, okay, let's take a little look. Let's take the notion of water. I'm going to show you a couple of different shutter speeds and what it means. So here's just a tiny little stream, and there's water tumbling over the rocks, and this is taken at 1/1000th of a second. Okay, so in 1/1000th of a second, and our brains do not register 1/1000th of a second. We can't register that fast. But what it does is it means that the water, all the water that's running down over these rocks has got frozen, and it's like glass, right? It's like glass or like ice. It's just got a solidity to it. You almost feel like you could sort of tap it and it would be solid. So 1/1000th of a second is capturing all these little droplets and freezing them in place. If I go to 1/4 of a second, so from 1/1000th of a second to 1/4 of a second, now what's happened is all the water that we would normally see as tumbling water has actually got frozen. It's getting smeared. Okay, so the amount of time it takes for the water to travel from here down through and round there, it's crossed quite a bit of the picture. And so across a case of 1/4 of a second, it's now looking quite smeared. It's not really looking like water as we know it. And then if I go to 6 seconds, so 24 times slower again, the water is now looking like mist. So much water's passed through it that the camera hasn't had a chance to lock onto anything. The only thing it's locked onto is the actual rocks and the moss. But the water here actually no longer looks like water. It looks like smoke, dry ice almost, kind of tumbling over the rocks. So there's an interesting thing about at what point so at this point, in some ways, we've almost lost the movement again, because we've now actually lost the fact that it is water. We can work it out, but actually I would say of the three of them, that looks more like moving water. That could be frozen glass, and that could be mist. So maybe if you're trying to make it look like water as we perceive it, even 1/4 of a second is too fast. Too slow rather. Maybe you want something like about 1/10th of a second or 20th of a second or something like that in order to actually kind of capture water as we see it. But then this goes back to this notion of the idea that actually it's kind of interesting when you play around with time. Are you wanting to smear time across the picture, or are you wanting to absolutely freeze a particular bit so every little bit shows up sharp? If we carry on with this notion of water, so down by the sea, bit of wind, waves coming in, and this one was taken at about 100th of a second. So 100th of a second is enough to kind of more or less freeze. We're starting to get little bits of movement blur, in the waves here, but we're getting this kind of where the wind is also capturing and creating. There's a word for it, I can't remember, but where the wind catches the spray. And so it almost blows it back again. But you really get that sense of the rough sea. Now, if this was done at 6 seconds or 20 seconds, if I'd had an ND filter on it or something like that, it wouldn't look anything like as rough. It would just be this kind of mist that was going on. If I'd done it at 1/1000th of a second, it would have looked much more solid, much more glass-like again. Whereas if we go for something like this waterfall, now this waterfall was taken at 5 seconds. Okay, so 5 seconds is allowed, it's got much more of that really misty kind of feel to it. And it's very, very different kind of mood. So But because of the shape, because we've got the rocks around it and we've got the autumn trees and we know that it's tumbling down, then we kind of accept the idea. It makes that it's water rather than mist. It's still not floating right all around the place in the way mist does. So it's an interesting kind of fun kind of thing to do. But again, flip the other way, go back to 800th of a second, and a fountain, water fountain, where droplets are coming down. Okay, so you've got the water coming down, and you can freeze again these moments, and you can capture these little moments. They look just like icicles. Okay, these frozen moments of water. So yeah, it looks like icicles where it's hanging off there, but of course we've then got all the bits that are just sort of hanging in midair as well. So it's that unnatural bit, that bit whereby we would never perceive it as such. Of course, other things you can do with liquid is pour it as well. In this case, making a cocktail, and suddenly forgot what this cocktail is. Gone completely out of my head. There's a name. This is quite a famous one. But anyway, it's been shaken up, it's been mixed up, and now it's being poured into the glass. Now you could, if you wanted, actually stage this and create some kind of plastic syrup thing, which, because we're not seeing full hard movement here, we're not seeing droplets falling. There's like a continual line that runs from top to bottom. So it could almost be you create some kind of silicone thing and paint it. Now, probably you wouldn't have gone to that much trouble to do so, but the point is that actually we know that that's pouring, so that has that sense of movement happening. Another thing that can happen with water particularly is a trail that's left in it. So if we kind of look at something like this, now the young swan doesn't appear to be moved. The captured frozen moment is not, there's nothing blurred here. 400th of a second, so we can zoom in and all the feathers are all really sharp. And if I just have it there like that, there might be no sense of movement at all. Except, and this is the key bit here, is the trail, is this triangle of water, the wave, what's that word? Somebody really want to scribble it in? There's the word where the wake. Is it a wake? I think it's a wake. The wake of the water as it ripples out behind the moving bird, just like you get when a boat goes past. And so this becomes an interesting sense of movement because, as I say, the fast shutter speed has frozen the swan. So the swan doesn't move, but you can see that the swan has been moving, is moving, because of the trail that has been left behind. And I think that's another way of interpreting movement as well. It's not just the object or the subject, but actually the effect of the subject on the environment that it's in. And it's worth keeping that one in mind as well. Excuse me one sec. What did John say? Interesting technique with the model. Oh yes, squirting of the paint. Right. Okay. So, keeping on the theme of birds, because birds, again, it's that notion of birds tend to be, well, unless they're sitting on the ground or they're sitting on water and not moving, we tend to, birds, because they're flying again is something that happens through space, happens through time. So like water tends to, unless you're going for a still pool, but if you're photographing moving water, it's a good place for movement. Basically what I'm saying here is water and birds are quite often a kind of a good default if you're stuck for anything else for the idea of trying to capture movement. Because water, if it's moving, as I say, you can do fast shutter speed, you can do slow shutter speed, you can get different effects. Birds are another thing which, as soon as they're flying, you know when you're looking at something that it's flying. So if we flick over to something like this, so this is just a gull leaving the post, and that notion now that the wings are out and the toes are just about to go. We know that it can't hold. It's not a frozen position. It can't be sort of static like that for a few seconds. This is a mid-movement. This is, and on top of that, I would say, an anticipation of the rest of the movement, which is quite an interesting one as well. So there's the movement and there's the anticipation of the movement. And this has got that kind of both. It's launching away. So sometimes it's quite a fun thing if you can get the birds just as they're sort of taking off. What else have we got? Or in this case, here we've got swallows sitting on a wire. And this, presumably the parent swallow, got like a little insect in its mouth. It looks like it's probably coming in to feed the younger swallow, which has got like little very tufts here. Still got last tufts of the kind of baby feathers as such. Now this one, if we go back to that notion of shutter speed, this here was taken at 200th of a second. And 200th of a second, when you're talking about a bird flapping its wings really fast, isn't enough to freeze the movement. So we end up with the wings all out of focus. But because the swallow has got that great control and is slowing down as it comes, 200th of a second was fast enough to capture the head in place. So the face looks like it isn't moving, but the wings are and the tail is. So that's at 200th of a second. If we go to 2000th of a second, 10 times faster, then we can end up with this. Now here we've got a bunch of sterlings attacking the bird feeder. Okay, so we put the bird feeder out, hoping for all the little birds, all the little robins and blue tits and great tits and chaffinches and what have you, and the starlings just like to kind of come in and descend and clear out all the seeds and nuts. But while they're swarming, then there's a way of that potential to kind of capture them in action. And here we go, this is 2000th of a second. And even at 2000th of a second, there's still little bits of blur. Well, mostly it's caught. Actually, some of that blur is just depth blur, because I've got this on quite a shallow of f3.2 and I'm using a 200mm lens. But that notion though, because this bird is hovering in mid-air, you've got all that sense of movement. You've got all these little birds here, wings coming out at different angles. So bird feeders, quite a good place to kind of capture. And also, again, worth playing around with different shutter speeds. Another bird one here, this one was at 1000th of a second. So here we have a sparrow just hovering above the grass. It was quite strange. I think I looked out the garden, I kept seeing this sparrow kind of hovering there, and then it would swoop down all of a sudden. In the same way that you see like that big kite, you see birds of prey hover and then they swoop down and grab the prey. And I'd never seen a sparrow doing that. And it kept doing it, and long enough for me to go and grab my camera and take a shot of it in the garden. This one I was 1000th of a second. And 1000th of a second, just enough for me to be able to capture it. So, I mean, obviously it's in one place and the wings are have to be moving pretty fast in order to be able to hold itself. I mean, they're not moving as fast as a hummingbird. If you're doing a hummingbird, you probably need 4000th of a second or something like that. I seem to remember Robert in Texas, I think, had a hummingbird, one where the wings are absolutely frozen just in front of the feeder at one point. But I think that was something like about 8000th of a second. So that notion then that birds, like water, are something which are moving. If they're hovering in midair, they have to be hovering, they have to be moving. And so the brain is interpreting, is going, movement is underway, because it wouldn't just be holding there in its own, on it, it's just defying gravity, floating in midair, not moving. It's not a static image, it's implying the notion of movement. Okay, so hopefully then you're starting to get a sense of what I'm talking about. That movement is four-dimensional. It's through space and through time. And we're capturing it in a two-dimensional space, a flat piece of paper or a flat screen. And so we're trying to trick the brain into assuming that there's depth and that there's time. So that there's space for the movement to happen within it. Okay. So these are so we need to kind of keep these in mind when we're working out how best to try and create an image which is really going to make somebody feel that you have captured that moment. I mean, another way is, if we go back to kind of that slow shutter speed thing, is car trails. I mean, some of you have tried this one before as well. So in that case, well, what have we got here? This is, again, about 1 second, 1.5 seconds or thereabouts. And in that, the cars are driving along and they are moving, and it's in night, and in 1.5 seconds the car has moved far enough to not be able to register as a, you know, it's moved, it's not stuck, but the lights have left their mark on the sensor. Apart from this one here, which is just turning the corner, you can see the indicator lights have gone, and there's, because it's slowed down to go around the corner, it's left, you know, we can see part of the car here, but the car ahead of it, which has already started pulling away, that's already gone. Okay, and there's even a smear white light here of a car that came in the opposite direction from the headlights. So that notion then of car lights, car trails, standing on a bridge, setting a exposure for 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, depending on what you've got, allowing cars to go past, leaving the light trails, is another recognised way of that sense of capturing movement. But then you can also play around a little bit with the idea of, I mean, these ones, one or two of you may have seen before, is like this, where what I did was I had the camera sitting on the dashboard of the car, and then setting a, what was the timer on this one? 6-second timer, f22 100 ISO, but it was dusk driving back. 6-second timer, you go click, and as you're driving then, you've got in-camera movement, as in the camera itself is moving because the car is moving, but then you've also got the cars themselves as they might overtake, turn off and move around. And so now we've got, there's this other sense of movement, which is the notion of camera movement itself. But camera movement on its own, there's a whole thing about in-camera photography, in-camera movement, where you can create things. But that's about moving the camera. It's not necessarily about the subject moving. It's about the person with the camera moving. It's about the camera movement. But in something like this, you're combining the two of them. So the camera is moving because it's inside the car, but it's also capturing other vehicles which are moving. And it starts getting really quite abstract at this point. Take it a step further, and this one here, I'd come round the little roundabout, just starting to head down. In fact, actually, we're back into Castle Douglas High Street, I think, but at the top end coming back down. And the car's going over a bump. There's other cars coming over the way. There's slowing down, speeding up, bits of trees, bits of house. But everything's really blurry and movement. Now, how much you go at this point, yes, it's capturing movement, but it's capturing movement to a point whereby we've essentially become so abstract that unless you know what it is you're looking at, it's really difficult to know what it is you're looking at. So I think if you're trying to, and again, all of this is part of thinking of you as people who are part of things like Photo Crowd or Viewbug or Guru Shots or camera clubs, where very often there are competitions that come up with these kind of titles capturing movement, then if you get too abstract, you're going to lose votes. Now, you may want to go down the abstract thing because that's actually a kind of a pursuit of art, a pursuit of your aesthetic, and that's great, that's brilliant, that's not a problem. If you're but the slight word of warning that if you're entering competitions with this, especially if they are crowd vote competitions rather than expert vote competitions, but if it's a crowd vote tends to be slightly more conservative and at least likes to know what it is it's looking at. Or Nick says, I like traffic trails and they're fairly straightforward to do. Yeah, especially if you've got at this point, generally speaking, I mean, this is sitting in the car and the car's moving, but generally speaking, use a tripod and you'll kind of get away with it. So that's kind of where you're playing around with that notion of car trails and movement like that. Now, the other thing with movement is the notion of the everyday, of people. Just that kind of, that sense of, again, if you take a photo of somebody who's static, who's standing there, they're not moving. If they're walking, the whole angles of the body, everything gives you a sense of movement that's going on. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. So here's an old family album photo, and this this was taken 19 years ago in France, and you have me and my daughter Meg. Okay, so you've got the back of me, and I can tell it's a long time ago because not only is the hair not grey, I don't have a great bald patch there either. We're walking into the sea in Normandy. Here's Meg. She's got her hair, she was really long, so it's actually tucked into her shorts at the back there, holding hands, just striding into the sea. Now, in terms of movement, the fact that the leg is coming up, you can tell that we're walking, that there's an intent in the movement. We're holding hands here, both of our legs are coming forward. So it's not fast movement, it's not speedboat movement, but it is movement. In underwater, again, a little bit like the bird, not as much, but there's splash, there's movement. You can see here actually that as Meg's pushing her leg forward, the water is building up in front of the leg and starting to run down. So you're ending up with the three-dimensionality. We're creating our own waves and ripples in the water. So what's that? VG says, sorry, one sec, just easier to read on this one, I think. Before we get that, John said intentional camera movement is popular around my area these days. Yeah, you can certainly play around with that. Yeah, it kind of comes and goes in phases, or really just, yeah, maybe it just depends on who you're hanging around with. But yes, there's times where it sort of suddenly seems slightly more fashionable. VG says, I always want to capture the water droplets, but tough as I do not have macro lens. I will see if I can rent and try. Seen water droplets that resemble a ballet dancer. Oh, now that's a different kind of thing. Yes, now I don't have any examples of that, but that's where you are, where people are working around with water droplets, and you kind of, and you could set up like a little pool, a tank, if a wash basin even, or a tray with water, and you isolate it so you can't see the background. And then you have a little something which is just dripping down. Anything like a small plastic bag with a tiny little slit in it, so little droplets are coming down, and then you freeze it and try and capture it. Now you can, and as the water comes down, hits the flat water underneath, it creates ripples and maybe a little bit bounces back up. You don't necessarily need a macro lens for it, if depending on what lenses you've actually already got, VG. If you zoom right in, so to just zoom right in and kind of, you can be back a little bit, zoom in as far as you can, and you will also probably, you'll be finding in order to capture it, ideally you might need some kind of off-camera flash to light it. But to be honest, I haven't done that really, so I don't have photos to show you, and there are 10,000 YouTube videos out there on how to get it. So I'd watch a few of them first. I'm fairly certain you don't necessarily need a macro lens in order to be able to do it, but it might depend on I suppose how close in you want to get. But yes, that's another one of capturing movement. In those cases, very often though, sometimes when they're creating, as you say, like the ballet dancer type of thing, there's a real sense of, it's less actually about the sense of movement, and it's more about, it almost looks like sculpted glass. So yeah, there's a whole area that I've not, unfortunately I can't help you with on that one. Okay, so next up then, so yeah, where was I? That notion of people and movement. So another example here. So on that same corner that we were just, where are we? This same corner here, where the car is going round, notice the sign there saying it's a one-way bit up here, and this little bit of corner there. That actually, this is the same one. Okay, there's the sign, there's the corner. Only here what we have is we have Harry, the lollipop man, who is then stopping the traffic for the school children to come out. And this day is absolutely chucking it down with rain. But again, that sense, Harry wouldn't just sort of stand there and pause in a moment. The girl with her dog on a lead here, they are obviously in movement. So that notion of capturing people as they're moving is one of those bits. And here's another one. This one is in a market in Morocco. again, very much a sense of movement going on. We've got the man leaning down, moving the onions. We've got the young lad leaping up. There's a sense of activity going on. Nobody's going to be pausing static in that position. So you really feel the movement. Probably accentuated slightly on this one as well because I've got a wide angle lens on the camera, and that's kind of creating a slight distortion. And we're looking into the corner over here. So that notion then as well, and we're starting to move into it, of diagonals and distortion and stuff can also add to a sense of movement. Now let's talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Other things here is, well, where this person isn't moving very fast, but he's got the leaf blower, and here we can see all the leaves flying up and moving around. So seeing somebody else moving through the space and the effect of what they're doing. So a bit like the effect of as you're pushing through the water's changing. Here the air blower is going and the leaves are flying up. So the effect of what people or an object or something is doing, and the effect that it's having on its environment, is another good way of capturing movement as well. But then we come to that, oh, one sec, what have we got here? Nick is saying, all right, this is to do with capturing the water droplets. Nick says, I've tried it with a zoom lens and it works okay. VG, pre-focus and then turn your camera to manual and use a tripod. Yes, I mean, that is the thing with that, is don't use the autofocus, because every time you go to click it, it's going to be searching again. So with anything like that, as you say, pre-focus it by, I mean, I've seen people they'll use like a thumbtack or drawing pin with a little blob of blue tack on it or something, which is where the water is going to fall. Focus your camera lens on that and then stick it on manual and don't touch it again, and then it will stay focused in the same place. Nadia says, VG, I think the ballet dance is created by a double water drop as the second drop hits the first splash as on its way back up. Yeah, very complicated. Quite a bit of fun though. Right, okay, so that's that notion of kind of, but there's also, what if we move on to that idea of the longer shutter speed with people? So let's flip back here. So in this case, what I did, this was taken indoors. I talked probably a couple of years ago about this particular shoot for the Kakubri Galleries, where I was photographed. They had the exhibition on, and okay, let me just double check that. This is a 5-second exposure. So I've got the camera on a tripod, 5-second exposure. What was interesting was in the space of 5 seconds, this couple here who are watching a TV screen where they're saying all about the Viking hoard that have been discovered in the region. They haven't moved. In that 5 seconds, they've stayed absolutely still. It doesn't look like this guy has even blinked. This person here has moved a little bit, so you can see that the leg has moved, so the background is partially visible through them. This person has been looking at this pot from the hoard, and in that 5 seconds they've been bent over and then they've stood up again. And so we've got this lovely little kind of movement here. Over here we've got somebody who obviously was there for probably maybe only one of the 5 seconds or 1.5, and then they've moved. And then here we have barely a hint of a foot with nothing else, a little bit of a leg, and then it disappears. So what we've recorded here is across 5 seconds, we've got multiple levels of movement, from no movement through to partial movement, through to movement that's taken the subject completely out of view. And so at this point, we're smudging time across the sensor. Another way of playing with this one. So this one was done with a ballet dancer, and so she's got a piece of cloth and she's moving around and she's moving the piece of cloth. Now this one, again, another 5-second exposure. In this particular movement, this foot hasn't really moved much. This leg's come out a little bit, but the cloth has started to move. She's waving it about. And you can see the hands here have taken where it's moved more, less of it has registered with the sensor. Now, so that kind of thing you can do as well. Capturing somebody as they're going through dance or movement can be quite interesting. Another version of this is actually where I took several photos. Well, I did take several photos of her doing this, and then I overlaid them. And at this point then, so this was, this I think was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 potential, 5 or 6 different photos. And each of them for 5 seconds long, but then actually overlaid so that they're all kind of moving through each other, and you get this real sense of this whole kind of dance thing going on at the same time. So that gives you other options to play with as well. Okay, lots of conversation going on now about how to do the little water droplet things. Are you listening to me, or are you too busy chatting away at the back of the class? Another one was this one as well, where you can get really quite abstract with it. Now this was a 1 second exposure, but this was actually a conductor. So I was in a place where there was a group of musicians, and they were rehearsing for a performance, and the conductor was out the front, and in that space of 1 second, the head's bobbed forward slightly, the hands have gone up and down, and you can see the baton, and you've got this lovely kind of curve coming around here. And then in the editing process, I played around with the contrast, darkened down the shadows in the background so that just the light parts remain. So this hand has come from here, swept up to here, and this hand you can see has got a whole kind of swirl movement around it as well. So at this point we've got a lot of movement in it, and it becomes really, I really like this one. But it is one of these again where, have I gone too abstract? How much do you have to know what it is before you see it? I love it as a photo, but I do have to say that in the online competitions, it never does particularly well. I fear that it's, even where it says intentional movement or blurred movement or something like that, I think this one is maybe just a touch too abstract for most tastes. VG says, very interesting shot, ghost-like. Now, sometimes you can get movement with, in something like this, where you've got the cyclists going past. Now, this was 250th of a second, so 250th of a second should normally be enough to capture, and, for the most part, the cyclists, as they're going past, are captured fairly still. But this was a wide-angle lens again, and as we get to the edge here, and this person that's going past me close up, see, again, there's that notion, if you're thinking about movement, and movement blur on a static image, if something is far away from the lens, if it's far off in the background, then if it's back here, it's going to take a while to cross the entire sensor. Okay, so it will capture, it will freeze much more. But if it's really close, it takes very little movement to go across the whole of the sensor. Okay, so the closer something is to the camera, the more the movement is likely to blur. Likewise, if you've got a zoom, the more you're zoomed in, the more likely it is to blur as well at the same shutter speed. So something like this then becomes quite interesting because it's frozen back here, but as you get closer, you get that movement blur. And then there was this one, which some of you may have seen before, which was a constructed scene whereby what we were trying to do was get this sense of everybody dancing. But I wanted to have the musicians frozen. I wanted you to be able to see that the musicians were playing. And what I did with this, this is a half second. This is a half second exposure. And so what we actually had to do was I had to go click with half second exposure, get the musicians to freeze on stage and get the audience to just dance about, leap about and swirl and twist. And we did this several times until we came up with something which seemed to work. And this was quite fun. So this was deliberately done, but the only way to get that movement of the crowd and to make it feel was to actually make sure that the musicians stood absolutely still for half a second. So we're at that point then where we're looking to try and capture movement, either by smearing time across the lens or by trying to freeze a moment that we wouldn't normally see frozen. And sometimes, like I say, sometimes images can work well because you really have that sort of sense of movement. Sometimes things can you've frozen the moment, but actually it just makes the whole thing look static. It doesn't make it look like it's necessarily moving. And the other thing to take into consideration then is that notion of ideally use your diagonals when you can. Remember I've talked before about that notion of the use of diagonals in photography, because diagonals add an energy. Diagonals adds automatically a kind of sense of movement to a picture. Verticals and horizontals always kind of add stability and staticness to an image, whereas diagonals always add an element of energy. So if you can introduce that sense of diagonal into it, you can quite often up that level of energy, or even make something which isn't moving very much appear to move more. So let me just give you an example. Okay, slight change here. So this one here, we've got the horse running towards us, right? Frozen moment, we've got bits of sand flying up, but the fact that the horse is slightly tilted also really adds that sense of energy and movement in a way that if it was absolutely upright, it might still have it, but not to quite the same degree. Now this one here, I want to show you too. So I'm taking a picture of Ian Cameron Smith at work. Now here he's using a grinder, quite an exciting shot, except for the fact that this is all about dominant verticals. So we've got the vertical of the beams, the horizontal of the beams, he's standing upright. And so though we've got the sparks flying off at different angles, there's quite a sort of static notion. There's that notion that he doesn't feel like he's really moving very much. Whereas if we go on to this one, where he's got a wood grinder and he's taking down this piece of grinding down this piece of wood, the fact that he is tilted at an angle really kind of adds to that sense of movement. It really pushes it that little bit more. Oh, John says, I really like your horse shot, and VG says, lovely horse pic, thank you. Similarly, there's this one here. Now, this is an interesting one. I've always loved this photo. So Tom, baker, he's baking in, so he's got his flour, he's creating a thing, and he's throwing it. He's adding air to it, creating. And here I managed, after several attempts, I managed to catch him with this piece of dough in absolute midair, frozen by the flashes going off. Tom's there, totally focused on it. Hands are coming out. In fact, it almost looks like it's levitating at this point. And oddly enough, although it's hanging in midair, so therefore it must be in movement, because again of the verticals, there's less sense of movement going on. Whereas when if we take a shot like this one, where he's putting flour onto, there's much more. That's sort of, although he's vertical, he's leaning slightly. The hand is coming out. We can see the flour flying out of here. And there's actually slightly more of a sense of movement in this one than there is in this one, even though we've got that large lump of dough hanging in midair. This version here, Jessica throwing her hair up into the air. So obviously very strongly movement. We've got the hair going up. Well, the hair going up in the shadow as well. But I would say that when we shoot at the diagonal, when we shoot at the angle, this feels much more strongly movement. What's that? Oh, VG saying amazing collection of photos. What a variety. Thank you. So can you see what I mean? That they both have this sense of movement, but this one feels slightly more solid. This one feels slightly more momentary. Likewise then, if we go into the notion of when I did these pictures of Doug Fitch making a pot, at this point the pot is spinning on the wheel, but the movement it feels more like the movement because of the sharp line of his elbow coming down into the picture. That's really kind of creating that sense. It's really accentuating that sense of movement, of energy, of something going on. This one here, we've got the diagonals, which again create that sense of movement, and then we've got added on the fact that he's squeezing out the sponge, and the clay water is just dripping down as well, creating splashes here. So there's much, again, that sense of movement. So by adding in the diagonals, we're really kind of accentuating that notion of movement. Okay, on to just the last couple of pictures. I want to show you how when we kind of bring these together. If we take something like here, Nith Inshore Rescue Boat. So on an RIB, rigid inflatable boat, something like that. I can't remember. Anyway, so we've got the boat going out on the River Nith, and there's the Criffel, a well-known hill landmark in the region. And here we've got that sense of movement because you've got the wake behind the boat, and the boat is lifted slightly, and we've got that diagonal. However, look what happens with this shot, where you can see they come round, they've kind of come down, they've curved. And so as well as having the boat pointing up, you can see the way the wake is coming out behind it. Okay, the splash is all flying up. So the trail, if we go back to that notion of swan here, the trail, the wake behind the swan is what's giving it part of the sense of movement. So this here, we've not just got the wake, but we've got a curve in the wake, and the curve doesn't happen naturally. So that's been caused by it. So it really is helping to accentuate. And then if we take this to its ultimate point, here when I'm actually on the boat, we can see the wake in this S-bend coming around here, which really kind of creates that sense of movement, because that would, even a wave might create a curve, but it's not going to create an S-bend like that. And then we've got a really strong sense of diagonal. Now what I did here was, rather than anchor this image to the horizon and give it a flat horizon, I anchored it to the vertical of the radio mast. So that's the kind of vertical bit here. And what that's meant is that the horizon is now at the angle, and the rest of it, because, so he's at a slight angle. So I'm on the boat, front of the boat here, wide angle lens. The wide angle lens is then accentuating it that little bit more, leaning over. Everything is coming together in this really dynamic sense of movement. You really kind of feel on the boat, tipping over, going at speed. So that's really kind of where I wanted to get to. So to kind of summarise what we've been talking about. Ultimately, movement is something that happens in 4 dimensions. Movement happens through time and through 3-dimensional space. We are trying to capture that in 2-dimensional space. So we are missing half the dimensions in order to capture movement. So we must use whatever tips, tricks and techniques we can to imply the movement. But then there's also the fact that movement is something that the human eye and brain perceive as happening and not frozen. When we see something still, we tend to think of it as static. So if we need to imply the idea of the movement, we need to have something like a before or an after, or a sense of it wouldn't be there naturally. So if something like the boy jumping is just hovering in midair, we know they wouldn't be hovering in midair unless they were jumping. But then there's also the opportunity to create things interesting to see as well, like frozen water or mist-like water, or smudges of people moving across the screen, or trails of light. All these things then give us something. It allows the camera to help us to see the world in a way that we would never naturally see it. All our ancestors who lived before the camera existed, who had never seen photographs, who had never seen slow shutter speed or very fast shutter speed images, had never experienced this. It's only us and a couple of generations above us who've, in the entirety of the history of humankind or life kind on this planet, who've actually had the opportunity to see frozen moments or smeared moments captured on a piece of paper or on a screen. So that's kind of fascinating and interesting. So hopefully then, with all this, I'm inspiring you to go ahead for the challenge. So the challenge then for 2 weeks' time, so about on the 30th of March, we're going to have the Capturing Movement Challenge. So there's loads of ideas here, and I really hope that you will have a go at trying to create something for it. Smug points to be won. Anybody who enters automatically gets 10 smug points, and then I'll have my top 3 for bonus 30, 20 and 10 extra smug points on top of that. So try and get your images to me no later than Friday the 28th of March, because I have to organise these and put them together. If you get it to me on Saturday morning, perhaps, but the later you leave it on Saturday, the less chance there is for me to actually include it. So really, you've got 2 weeks, or you've got 12 days, say, to get your picture together. So that, I think, pretty much kind of pulls that together. So hopefully you'll be interested in that. So coming up then over the next couple of weeks, what I would say then is for anybody who happens to be in this corner of Scotland, next Saturday, the 15th of... actually, no, sorry, I've just realised the competition isn't on the 30th. The competition is on the 23rd. My mistake, I'm completely mixed up. It's the 9th today. So yes, the competition will be on the 23rd of March. So yes, please keep that one in mind. Okay, so go back then. So the 15th, next Saturday, I am running a mobile phone or cell phone workshop. Okay, so here in Castle Douglas at the Crannog, down on the loch side of Clattering Shores, Carlingwalk Loch in Castle Douglas, I'm going to be running a workshop on how to improve your phone photography. So if you happen to be in the region for that, then come along, or if you know anybody who's in the region, then let them know about it. I'm going to be trailing it a bit this week on Facebook. So that's Saturday for locally. So Sunday next week then, my intention is to do a podcast about photographing people from different angles. So it's about portraits, the difference between what happens when you shoot from above, what happens when you shoot from below, from far away, from close up, how it changes the angle, how it changes your perception, things like that. Because I think very often with portraits and when we're photographing people, we just tend to go to a default. Here's my eye level, I shoot you at the way that I'm seeing you just as I happen to be sitting here. And I think there's a lot to be explored there. So that's what I'm going to be looking at next week. 2 weeks time then, so the 23rd of March, correcting myself, 23rd of March, we're going to have the Capturing Movement Challenge. And then on the 30th, we come back on the 30th, and North America and UK are realigned on time slots, I'm going to have a feedback session. So if you're wanting to get images in advance or whatever to get feedback on, I will be doing a feedback session on the 30th. So that's March pretty much covered. So I hope that all makes sense to everybody. A little reminder that if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Another thing to remember is we have our Flickr group, flickr.com/groups/UPwKA, UPwKA, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. So join the group, start leaving comments. It's not very well attended at the moment. We've only got about a dozen or 15 members, and I think everybody forgets that it's there. But if we can start kind of put questions in, stick pictures in, start discussions going. Also, we'll keep everybody up to date on what podcast is coming up and what the Smug Points Leaderboard is doing as well. So hopefully then, yes, I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye. Oh, no, not that one. This one.